Can you announce, are they ready to start serving?
I think so.
I see some of the stuff are still closed.
Okay.
Check with them
Okay.
first. Do you know about Credible? So, is there a main sponsor? They haven't gotten any mic time in an audience.
No,
So they were going to. Is Power Notes doing anything today at lunch? I don't think they are. But I think Credible just wanted to talk for a couple minutes. Is that okay?
He said 2 minutes exactly.
Okay. And so,
I was like, nope.
thank you. And you know what? You mean to grab it?
Yes, you found it. Okay.
Thank you. Like,
Sorry,
you would have
no
saved my.
I was like, nope.
Thank you. And you know what? You mean to grab it?
Yes, you found it. Okay.
Thank you. Like,
Sorry,
you would have saved my.
I also. Yeah,
Okay. Should I take mute this so it's not next talk in the background?
Yes. So further we do I cannot get a presentation before because my license is so we have to say like look up this stuff. Okay, because
Sure.
and then do we want to
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so we have background music. That's interesting. Yes, please. So, first of all, thanks to Power Notes for sponsoring this lunch. So, please give them a round of applause and thank you. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dominic DelliCarpini is the Maynard Endowed Professor of Writing Studies and Dean of the Center for Community Engagement at New York College of Pennsylvania, where he also served 13 years as WPA, 5 years as Chief Academic Officer and as Academic Senate President. Because he has worked exclusively as a high school teacher and a teacher administrator in small teaching colleges, he feels that those identities fit him best. He's the author, editor of 5 writing textbooks, as well as some articles and book chapters. DelliCarpini describes his presentations and publications as deriving from the scholarship of teaching and learning and other practical lived experiences, writing as civic engagement, writing program administration, and first-year writing pedagogy. In his earlier days, he has also owned and operated 2 small businesses, a bakery, cafe, and a retail clothing business.
Now you know why we like him.
And failed miserably in a third startup, a monthly Philadelphia arts and entertainment magazine, which made it through 2 issues. Yay! He earned his BA in English from the University of Pennsylvania and Master's and PhD from the Pennsylvania State University, where he was an Edwin R. Sparks Fellow and recipient of the Outstanding Teaching Assistant Award for the College of Liberal Arts. Dr. DelliCarpini served as President and Executive Board member of the Council of Writing Program Administrators, National Secretary of the Conference on College Composition and Communication, and a member of the National Committee on Undergraduate Research. Dr. DelliCarpini was named recipient of the 2017 York County Economic Alliance Spirit of York County Award for Community Service and the 2010 Professional Service and Leadership Award by York College. He was appointed by Pennsylvania's Governor Wolf to the board of PennServe, the Governor's Commission on Public Service, and elected as board director for the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He also serves on the board of directors for the York County Libraries, York County Community Foundation, the York County Bar Foundation, for which he served as president, the Healthy York Coalition, and various other community organizations. In addition, he is founding director of the Grant Innovation Scholars, an honors program for York College students based on principles of human-centered design thinking, and high-impact educational practices such as undergraduate research and community-based learning. He founded and administers the annual Naylor Workshop on Undergraduate Research and is co-editor of the Naylor Report on Undergraduate Research and Writing Studies, as well as other articles on this topic. But right now, he is mostly interested in 5 specific initiatives in support of York City. Only 5, by the way. A place that still suffers from deeply ingrained and race-based poverty, the effects of somewhat past redlining, lack of pathways to generational wealth, and deep health inequities. Through the support of generous donors and with the leadership of the Center for Community Engagement team, DelliCarpini administers the Urban Collaborative, which aims at housing equity and stability. The Arthur J. Gladfelter Institute for Public Policy, which does research in support of economic mobility. The Institute for Social Healing, which provides intellectual support for trauma-based care, and the Changemaker Service Network, which oversees service learning at the college. The center also actively engages with and financially supports the group violence intervention team, who are working to improve the lives of those impacted by gun violence and the resultant trauma in a city that suffers from the highest per capita rate of gun violence of any third-tier city in Pennsylvania. In all of these roles, he has admired and learned from those who lack privilege in the youth community for their ability to take care of one another and for the way they have claimed and used their own languages, which are at their heart languages of love and care. He is married to a social justice advocate called Rabia Khan, which we are happy to have her among us today, who speaks those languages, though with a British accent as well. Please welcome Dr. Dominic DelliCarpini, past president of CWPA.
Thank you, Lillian, and thanks to all of you for listening. Do let me know if you're all hearing me okay. Do you want to hear me? I'm gonna speak for a while. I hope that afterward we can have some conversation either here or throughout the rest of the conference. For WPA, social justice lives in a liminal space between the personal and the professional. It involves us in both institutional and personal history, in administrative strategies, as well as self-examination. In this autoethnography, and I'll call it that, it's a nice new term. What I'm saying is to talk a lot about myself, but in this autoethnography, I'd like to explore key moments in my own and this profession attempts to do social justice WPA. As you listen, I hope you'll be thinking about your own stories as well, and we'll share them with one another throughout the rest of the conference. I do want to thank my wife, Rabia Khan. My thoughts are enriched by what I have learned from a true social justice advocate. What I have heard our community say about Rabia is this: if there is a fight that requires a warrior, she is the one to turn to. She's an activist against Islamophobia with CARE, an investigator and commissioner for our Human Relations Commission, a communications specialist for our community foundation, and an influential speaker on social justice issues in our community. Rabia has helped me to see how language can be used as a tool of resistance and identity for my own community work, and you heard about some of that in the introduction. My thanks to Rabia also for her help on this talk. She is my best editor, and from the beginning of our relationship reminded me that words matter, has called me to be bolder in my own social justice work, and has been willing to tell me the truth about the things I write and say. So if you don't like my speech, talk to my editor. Let me begin by explaining my title, The Gordian Knot. My use of this metaphor for discussion of the WPA's dilemma is based on the story that I'll recount a little bit from an explanation from the Penn Museum. While at Gordian, this is a quote, while at Gordian, Alexander, the Macedonian king, learned about a special wagon that was situated in the temple of Zeus. The pole of the wagon was tied to the wagon body with an intricate knot of cornel bark. And a prophecy had foretold that whoever could unfasten the knot would go on to rule over Asia. Seized by a longing to test the prophecy, Alexander tried to unfasten the knot by unraveling it, but when he was unable to do so, he drew his sword and cut right through it. From this comes the proverbial expression to cut the Gordian knot, meaning to cut right to the heart of a matter without wasting time on external details, end quote. In other versions, however, Alexander does find a way to untie the knot. He removes the linchpin from the pole to which the cart was tied, exposing the two ends of the rope, and making it possible to untie it. Those two versions might represent our choice as we look at the injustices around us. Do we act swiftly and decisively, or do we continue to look for the linchpins that will allow us to unravel the puzzle? In some ways, that is the choice before us as we assemble here in response to Dr. Mina's call. As she wrote, we gather, quote, after 4 turbulent years that split us apart on many issues and brought us together on others, to ponder and contemplate the imprints these 4 years have left on us as individuals, on our writing programs, and on our organization. Today, I'd like to look back even further, looking for linchpins that might help us to unravel the increasingly complex tasks we face. Let's start with a prior question, one we need to ask because it is so frequently asked of us. What does social justice have to do with writing and program administration? I might answer that question with the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, words that Justice Sotomayor cited in her dissenting opinion on the recent affirmative action decision. Because, she wrote, enslaved people fuse their desire for literacy with their desire for freedom. As Sotomayor also reminds us, the desire to deny literacy is in effect a desire to deny freedom. She boldly articulates what we know as well, that this case is about more than college admissions. Using Heather Andrea Williams' words from Self-Taught, she frames literacy as, quote, an instrument of resistance and liberation, which provided the means to write a path to freedom, unquote. The message of students' rights to their own language is similar. I invoke that resolution, and I do mean this as a type of invocation, because it is of its central ethical message, succinctly captured in these 2 sentences. The claim that any one dialect is unacceptable amounts to an attempt of one social group to exert its dominance over another. Such a claim leads to false advice for speakers and writers and immoral advice for humans. So why is social justice our business? Because we are among the social groups with the authority to exert this dominance, or not. We are among the social groups giving moral advice to humans. What we do isn't just a professional act, it is a social one. So how we do it matters, and it matters a great deal. Thus, perhaps the linchpin to which our scholarship has continuously tied other multiple scholarly knots looks at its simplest something like this. We administer programs for institutions that expect us to teach standardized writing skills. How can we do that without becoming a social group that exerts its dominance over another? Most of us feel, even internalize, this knot in our gut. While many teachers confront it in their classrooms, WPAs feel the full force of questions like those posed by the Students' Right to Their Own Language Task Force. And here I quote, shall we place our emphasis on what vocal elements of the public think it wants, or on what the actual linguistic evidence indicates we should emphasize? We must decide what elements of our discipline are really important to us, and whether we want to share with our students the richness of all varieties of language, encouraging linguistic virtuosity. Oh, for goodness sakes, really? You're laying all this on us? Well, the steering committee, while challenging us deeply, also quietly offers us a possible way out. They write, shall we blame the business world by saying, well, we realize that human beings use language in a wide variety of ways, but employers demand a single variety. Indeed, that is one way to cut, or at least to avoid the knot. Simply discount the background and language of our students because we are serving another purpose, and doing it with the best interest of our students in mind. Following that path, our job seems simpler. Prepare students for a social structure that we know devalues other dialects. As WPAs, the pressures to take that path are real. They are inscribed within our job descriptions, and perhaps may even keep the immediate interests of our students in mind. But now the game has changed and the stakes are higher. We treat this moment as just another instance of the world not understanding us at our peril. The current culture wars are much more dangerous than past culture wars. Democratic deliberation itself is under attack. Those who wish to restrict civil rights have a strategy, and now they have unleashed it, seemingly all at once, with shock and awe. Roe v. Wade, gone. Affirmative action in college admissions, gone. Protections against acts of discrimination by businesses, going and likely to be gone. Book banning, gaining traction through Moms for Liberty. And it is not just us who feels it, it is our students. And I'll tell you from my work, it is our communities. So yes, we could compromise. All of us have likely asked how we might pull the rope on social justice without further tightening the rope around our program's viability, without risking the life and careers of colleagues and students for whom we are responsible. But such compromises take a toll on us, no? And as I'll demonstrate, it's often been more like surrender than compromise. It makes me think about Linda Abner Kastner's work in the activist WPA, where she cites Carl Llewellyn in saying, strategy without ideals is a menace, but ideals without a strategy is a mess. We are in a mess. I worry too that under these pressures we have come to accept, even rely upon our role as targets, living a kind of Stockholm syndrome. Like the old story about the frog, put it in boiling water and it jumps out. Put it in cold water and bring it slowly to a boil and the frog remains and dies. We have been in a slow boil for some time. Something I can see as I think back over a career of watching such moments. Unlike most of you in attendance, I was a student already in 1971 when Students' Right to Their Own Language was being written by a 4Cs working group. As I innocently learned standardized English in my 8th grade English class in a nearly all-white St. Catherine of Siena elementary school, and there's no one quite like Catholic nun to guard language purity, there was a group of progressive scholars working on Students' Right to Their Own Language. When it was adopted by 4C's Executive Committee in 1972, I was an entering secondary student at Archbishop Carroll High School in suburban Philadelphia. By the time it was published in 3Cs in fall of 1974, I was a junior there. I, of course, was blissfully unaware of any of this. But I was aware that something was in the wind that felt like change. We were reading things like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the Beat and Harlan Renaissance poets, and treating the activist lyrics of Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan as the new poetry. As I was experiencing atrocities through a child's eyes, the 1968 My Lai massacre in Vietnam, the 1970 Kent State shootings, the 1972 Wounded Knee uprisings, as well as the oppression of civil rights activists and the assassinations of our beloved civil rights leaders, I was fortunate that my teachers had the freedom to teach from the world in which we were living. That is one of the important freedoms that is now being taken from educators and from students as they try to process all of what they are seeing in the world. Yet even in that more progressive era, when reading was less constrained, the right to exercise ownership of writing was still off limits, seen as the province of only creative writers. For the rest of us, language had rules. Rules that, according to those that taught us, were the pillars of the polite, civilized, educated, that is, MLA compliant and white academic society. In my privileged world, that was relatively comfortable. The language of my culture just needed some finishing. But my recent work in the York, Pennsylvania community and with undergraduate researchers had made me mindful of how much larger and more painful it is for others. Looking back, I can see that my classmates and I experienced others' dialects largely as a spectacle. We were voyeurs, getting a peek at exotic works and exotic writers and lived experiences outside what we still saw as the norm. Still, with all these limitations, reading more widely gave me a glimpse of a world where language's rules were not the measure of language's effectiveness. It left an impression. Those experiences are now under attack. School boards and the Orwellian-named Moms for Liberty are taking books away from white readers, and courts are taking people of color away from our college classrooms. Both will make our ability to do social justice work more difficult and less effective. They have a strategy. So why does this matter to me specifically? I am a privileged first-generation college student. I advanced on the shoulders of a previous generation of DelliCarpinis and Palekia immigrants who never attended college, none of them, and for whom English was a second language. I think I became proficient at writing because my father was unable to write edited American English and struck a deal with me. My father, who started his career in the sweatshops of New York's Garment District, was a bit of a cynic. As he started to earn a living wage, he felt that all businesses, retailers, contractors, service providers, were out to cheat him. So the deal he made with me was this. If he felt he had been cheated, which was almost always, he would ask me to write a letter of complaint. If we received a refund or compensation, we split it. So as a young student, I did not learn about the sophist. I was one. I was a hired language gun. That was my education in early Greek rhetoric. As I learned about rhetoric from watching my uncle, I also learned about watching rhetoric, learned about rhetoric from watching my uncles play bocce, I'm going to slip through here, where they showed me that language was superior to geometry and physics. Who won was not about who actually got their bocce ball closest to the polina. It was more about who could convince the others that it was closer. They never measured, they argued, until someone conceded. That was my education in Roman rhetoric. But their world was not the world my parents wanted for me. They pushed me to pursue a college education so that, as my father always said, I wouldn't end up as a ditch digger. As a young adult, I didn't know why that was his term of choice. Only later did I realize why. My father had watched his father work as a ditch digger for the Citizens Conservation Corps during the Depression. That was my 3 C's, emblazoned on the shovel my dear ditch-digging grandpa used, and that I still use. My father later told me that when the Corps members didn't have enough work to do planting trees, they instead were made to simply dig ditches and fill them back in. An early version, I suppose, of welfare reform to keep folks from getting lazy. And yes, I am in the possession of stolen government property, for which I'm sure my dad is smiling down on me. When I moved on to college, I needed to take on a new persona. I became even whiter. Handed the opportunity to move beyond my family's lack of access to higher education, I climbed to the pinnacle of white privilege. I studied literature at the University of Pennsylvania. I found myself more at home as a Brit than an Italian American. I had gone as far as a person could go from ditch digger. I studied the liberal arts. That is until my actual family roots made me start to feel useless and guilty. After graduating with my BA in English and having the usual English major what next moment, I found my way into teaching in the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia. For 10 years, I taught high school English in Philadelphia and its working class suburbs. I began my teaching career with underprepared students in South Philadelphia. They were called fourth track students, those without hope of college. 2 things happened as I taught those students. First, I realized that I could help them towards literacy, and I could do so by building on their natural language skills and lived experience. South Philly Italians can be very persuasive, and they felt very much like my people. I still remember the delight on their face when I told them that they would, in the end, be more successful than the first track students because they understood the real world better. I still believe that. I also lived in the community in which I taught, South Philly, Philadelphia's Little Italy. There I recovered proficiency in my mother tongue, the language of urban working class Italians. You know what I mean. Beautiful. Through all of this, I was unaware of students' right to their own language, the resolution. I was simply seeing that given the right to their own language, students' self-esteem, confidence, and ability to communicate ideas improved dramatically. It was only a decade later when I returned to graduate school and learned composition theory at Penn State that I was able to reflect upon what I experienced firsthand. I really began thinking seriously about students' right to their own language, though, in a recent Naylor workshop in undergraduate research in writing studies. As part of my work as the Naylor Endowed Professor, and through the generous endowment offered by Mr. Irv Naylor, your college has for the last 8 years sponsored an annual workshop that invites undergraduates from around the country to gather and work on their research and progress. It's a small undergraduate version of Dartmouth's seminar for writing research. The NELR workshop has given me insight into what matters to our students and what they ask of us. As I wrote in a recent article in Pedagogy, I explore how their work is, quote, often not a disembodied intellectual interest, but an affective or embodied attachment directly related to their identity and lived experience, unquote. I'm a real academic now, I can quote myself. I saw these motives as they wrote things like this in their applications to attend. Maria Claramello of Florida State wrote, I'm a first-generation Brazilian American queer woman, and trauma seems to stick to me like love bugs to a windshield during a Florida June. Kayla Watugu from the University of Hawaii wrote, rhetoric became a way to understand the condition of our existence. I saw how rhetoric can be used to both construct and deconstruct identities and realities. As a person of Kanaka Maoli, or native Hawaiian descent, I believe studying rhetoric and its impact on our identity to be a significant part of my kuleana, that is, responsibilities, privileges, and duties, giving voice to those who do not have the same privilege as I do. Ella McKenzie of Marymount Manhattan College offered this, my interest in literacy education started almost 10 years ago, when I had to repeat the third grade. It was a dark period of my life filled with humiliation and alienation. Not only did I feel like I was incompetent and slow, I also felt misunderstood by my teachers. This is exactly why hip-hop pedagogy is needed in education. And I want to thank David for his talk yesterday that discussed this as well. Like many children my age, hip-hop is the only place where I saw my struggles and circumstances authentically displayed. In the times we live in today, where so many minorities in this country feel marginalized and alienated by society, education and literacy can arm them with the knowledge to combat oppression. That from one of our undergraduate students. And Nidhi Gandhi from Hofstra explained, this work is important to me as a researcher because as an immigrant with immigrant parents, I can see the communication problems my parents have when conversing with native English speakers. It was also Nidhi who challenged me and all of us at the NELR workshop to own students' right to their own language. She stood up in our final general session and said, without anger, but with commitment, you all love to talk about students' right to their own language. When are you going to actually allow us that? These are the words that have inspired me to think more seriously about the work I do as a writing teacher, and I still do teach writing. And I will put on the screen now, not read, some of the other thoughts of these students that I want to hang over us as we consider the work before us. My current thinking about the core principles of students' right to their own language became more urgent because of how these principles were embodied in students like these. That leads to questions we all have asked. Why have WPAs been given so little freedom to follow what we know from our research? Why can't we build our programs like other fields on disciplinary knowledge without public outrage? At first, I thought it was just because we have strayed into social justice instead of staying within, to use Linda Brodke's term, our designated areas, educating students in edited American English. But now I'm starting to wonder something else. Perhaps they're afraid of us. Perhaps we in fact do have some power and some authority. Perhaps we should, with Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, have faith that offering dissenting opinions and helping students offer dissenting opinions is important in keeping resistance alive. And finally, perhaps it is precisely those nagging perhapses that have tied us in knots. Let's look back a bit and think about the times that we have surrendered. 1990, Brodke versus the conservative media, or the genealogy of the white guilt narrative. It did not take long for the backlash against the social uprisings of my childhood to visit. The presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and even many of the policies of Bill Clinton were responses to the civil and human rights revolts of the decades before. In our profession, those times brought things like the so-called troubles in Texas, which many of you have read about, but which I lived through at a formative moment. As I entered my PhD program at Penn State in 1990, the backlash over Linda Brodke's writing about difference curriculum was being debated in both public and academic venues. In May of 1990, Kirby Moss interviewed English Department Chair Joseph Krupa for the Austin American Statesman. Krupa explained that the curriculum, quote, will allow students a chance to examine landmark court decisions on civil rights and affirmative action, and that it was designed to show the necessity of understanding social implications of difference in race, ethnic background, age, gender, sexual preference, and religion, unquote. At the same time, Krupa justified the course within the frame of more conventional outcomes. He noted that those materials are playing a similar role to composition readers, and that, quote, freshman composition will still basically be a course in argumentation, how to weigh evidence and build cohesive arguments, unquote. He assured the reporter that students will also continue to write compositions after receiving classroom instruction on how to plan and organize their topics, unquote. But more troubling was the fact that Krupa felt the need to extricate the course from the lived experience of University of Texas students. He assured Moss that, quote, the change is not a reaction to spring demonstrations at UT seeking ethnic diversity. The change, said Krupa, was planned concurrent to the protests. This despite the fact that Krupa also admitted for the record that actually a lot of this was already happening on campus because students wanted to discuss ethnic and racial issues, unquote. I cite this at length not to be critical of Dr. Krupa. In fact, as administrators, let's admit, we can certainly empathize. We tie ourselves in the knots frequently as we try to explain what we do. I noted to raise a few other facts of our lives. One, we feel compelled to apologize in both the common and rhetorical sense for examining social justice issues in our classroom. Two, we feel compelled to contextualize social justice work within the institutional goals of what Sharon Crowley has called the universal requirement of first-year writing. That is our job, to standardize language for all students, so we better lead with that goal. Indeed, Moss's article notes that, quote, all students at UT must have credit for English 306, framing the curriculum as inescapable. And third, we sometimes feel compelled to ardently deny that our curriculum is a response to students' lived experience. Well, when we accept the premise that teaching argument is only an academic exercise, that it should not be tied to identities and experiences of our students, we concede too far, and we admit guilt. After all, it's not as if after conceding a few points, the curriculum was blessed. Instead, it was attacked more vehemently in public venues and put on hold by the dean, much to the delight of columnists like William Murchison of the Kilgore News Herald. Murchison wrote about, quote, plans by the University of Texas English Department to organize its freshman composition course around the theme of racism and sexism, calling it, quote unquote, a lousy idea. He went on to assure readers, we can relax at last. The Dean of Liberal Arts, Dr. Standis Meacham, noting strenuous opposition within the faculty, has shelved difference, racism and sexism, for a year's study. And then he goes on to write, cremation would have been a more fitting solution. We should have learned by now that when we concede our values, the reaction is usually not gracious. It is to continue to burn them until they are ash. Simply stated, this ain't working. Particularly telling are the reasons why Murchison calls the course a stinker. All familiar parts of our Gordian knot. After adding the obligatory, nobody denies, I hope, that educated people need to understand the various cultural strands that make up America. Murchison asks, do you center an English composition course on the viewpoint, telegraphed in the course title, that it's time to write about the great evils that society must combat and overcome? How does this make for objective thinking or for objective grading, unquote? He also ties us up in the universal requirement knot of our own making. This was, quote, a syllabus to which 3,000 freshmen would have been subjected, unquote. And the language purity myth, quote, were the students going to learn to write clear English or to think correct thoughts? He even capitalizes correct thoughts emphasizing his belief that this course sounds like, quote, indoctrination 101, and that it imposes upon white America a guilt trip. This was in 1990. Future policies in Florida and elsewhere had their test case. But if we listen closely, we might also hear some fear in the "we can relax at last." There was real anxiety in the idea that 3,000 first-year students would be asked to read court documents about civil rights as related to race and sexism. And there is worry that it might allow for discussion of students' concerns about ethnic diversity. We do have some agency. Asking students to read and consider primary source documents that are affecting the world in which they live is not indoctrination. It is a lesson in civics, a lesson in active citizenship, and a lesson in analytical thinking. And even conservative thinkers agree that attention to American civics is much needed. We sometimes miss the linchpin that might help us unravel the knot. Let's move to 1996. From the troubles in Texas to the troubles in Oakland. John Law and Josiane Messier both point us to the media backlash over the Oakland School Board's resolution on Ebonics, and especially to an editorial by Brent Staples of the New York Times. In that editorial, Staples refers to Ebonics as, quote, broken inner city English, and as street talk, and as urban slang. He claims, acknowledging Ebonics, quote, patronizes inner city children, holding them to abysmally low standards, unquote. He objects to, quote, declaring all students to be equal, regardless of whether they have difficulty speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language. And he asserts that the resolution will undermine serious education as, quote, time that should be spent on reading and algebra gets spent giving high fives and chattering away in street language, unquote, and will further isolate children who are already cut off from mainstream values and ideas. What we are facing now is not new. It's just more serious. If we can look beyond the offensive attitudes towards African American vernacular and African Americans, which of course is impossible to do, we find that many of the usual tropes are here. Most centrally, that providing students with mainstream values and ideas, that is the dominant culture's ideas and values, is the central goal of literacy education. Much like the Broadkey case in higher ed, it brought literacy education at the secondary level under scrutiny, adding another twist to our Gordian knot. But we don't seem to know how to defend what we know, at least not publicly. In response to public outcry, the resolution was amended. As noted by Baugh, the amended text expresses the aim of, quote, a program featuring African American system principles to move students from the language patterns they bring to school to English proficiency. The concept that students have a right to their own language was reframed as a bridge to teaching English proficiency. That is, proper English. That still makes the language patterns they bring to school not just different, but wrong, inferior, and of less value. Meanwhile, in 1996, this organization was beginning work on the WPA outcome statement. There are, of course, multiple narratives of why and how the WPA outcome statement, perhaps our most influential document, came to be. The recent CWPA turmoils have raised questions not only about the content of the outcome statement, but whether we can or should have one. If we trace the outcome statement back to its genesis, we might better understand it as one of the more intricate loops in our Gordian knot. Through the lens of students' right to their own language, I think we can acknowledge that our outcomes can feel like serving too many masters, and sometimes being masters ourselves. But that was not its original intent. As chronicled in 2023 by Patricia Freitag Erickson, on March 13, 1996, Gordon Grant from the University of Charleston asked WPA list members for a, quote, pithy and effective list of objectives for their writing programs, since the committee drafting outcomes for writing either refuse or are unable to acknowledge that a body of scholarship guides their work. And they're relying on our own prejudices and memory of their own current traditional classrooms experiences for how they form these outcomes. In response, Ronnie Kane agreed, noting that it would be useful for people like myself, who are the only ones in the department who are trained in the field, and, quote, would provide some authority to invoke when we find ourselves under siege. The WPA outcome statement was written to give isolated and beleaguered WPAs some authority to invoke when we find ourselves under siege. It accomplished that purpose for me as a new WPA and for many others, yet when we layer students' right to their own language over it, the not again tightens. A question, therefore, remaining before this organization after the tumult then is whether the outcome statement or any revision of it is still of value as, quote, a curricular document that speaks to the common expectations for students of first-year composition programs in the United States, unquote. Are there still planks in that document that, with some remilling, can help us? For instance, the outcome statement calls for rhetorical knowledge to, quote, respond appropriately to different kinds of rhetorical situations. It suggests that students adopt appropriate voice, tone, and level of formality, and that they write in several genres. How might we articulate our beliefs in ways that are truly inclusive of the languages of varied communities, and to demonstrate how having the ability to demonstrate how having that ability actually can be useful for the diverse real world we live in now? How might we use the word appropriately in a less value-laden way? Or if we believe that by the end of first-year composition, students should understand the relationship among language, knowledge, and power, a quote from the outcome statement, we might ask how we might create opportunities for students to inquire into that power dynamic, much like the undergraduate researchers and the questions they asked at the Naylor workshop. And as we ask students to, quote, control such surface features as syntax, grammar, punctuation, and spelling in their writing, how might we help them and the public to understand how syntax, grammar, and punctuation varies by dialect and language cadences and are not simply owned by the dominant culture? That is, how can we think about the word, what it means to control these features? Those conversations, I believe, could help us to move past some essential internal loops in our Gordian knot. But there is much work to be done. As I conclude, I'll bring us back to 2023 after one last glance at the past. 1996, that same year that I've been discussing, also saw the publication of Ellen Cushman's landmark essay, The Rhetorician as an Agent of Social Change. In this essay, Cushman called out the, quote, colonizing ideology of scholars who maintain a distance from people as they do their community-based research. That message stays with me in my current work as Dean of our Center for Community Engagement. We simply cannot afford to maintain a scholarly distance from our communities any longer, not when actions of the Supreme Court and others have, as Justice Jackson put it, made things worse, not better. As she writes, quote, the best that can be said of the majority's perspective is that it proceeds ostrich-like from the hope that preventing consideration of race will end racism. But if that is its motivation, the majority proceeds in vain. If the colleges of this country are required to ignore a thing that matters, it will not just go away. It will take longer for racism to leave us. And ultimately, ignoring race just makes it matter more, unquote. I highly recommend reading Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson's long and really well thought out dissents. As I look at where we have been and where we are now, I think we may have missed better ways to consider and to defend students' right to their own language from the very start. It is not only about what marginalized students lose, but what literacy experts and what communities lose when we stay in the ivory tower and ignore the language of underserved communities. As Cushman reminds us, language is always already embodied in people, in their sincere need to express their thoughts, emotions, and aspirations. And as I've seen in my community work within a deeply segregated and impoverished York City, their grief and their longing. We cannot separate language from the multiple tongues that speak it and the multiple hands that write it. Our students and our communities are crying out for both tangible and moral support. While admissions departments may be compelled to ignore race and the history of racial inequity, we do not need to do so. Our role is not to go out in the community as anthropologists, ready to study other cultures from a distance without returning anything to them. We ought not blame the business world for only accepting homogeneous language while we act as part of the structure that homogenizes it. My work in the community also has helped me to let go of my own false perspective that one community is fundamentally better than the other because it is more prosperous, and that one language style is fundamentally better than another because it is the lingua franca. I will try to demonstrate that in the written version of this talk. We'll be glad to talk with any of you about my experiences in my community at this conference. But for now, let me acknowledge that the places where people use standardized English are more prosperous, and they're certainly safer. But better? And is communication stronger in my suburban home than in the impoverished city in which I work, in which people lend support to one another every day through their communication? That's not been my experience. And is the use of standardized language a natural condition for entry to prosperity? Or is it, as universal design would suggest, a fabricated barrier that academia has constructed for entry? A knot that we have failed to unravel or cut, thereby making, in Justice Jackson's word, things worse, not better. If entry to our culture requires loss of identity, then what are we to say to students like the ones I cited, who are committed to social justice? And you can look at the quote on the top of the screen right now to get some idea of what Kayla Watubo thinks of this. I'm hoping they were not expecting me to play Alexander to cut through the Gordian knot. That has to come collectively and perhaps retroactively. Somehow, and it likely comes from a place of kindness and a sense of justice, we came to believe that it was our authority to recognize or not the viability of various community languages. Communities do not need us to affirm their right to their own language. They own it, and they use it anyway, and they use it quite effectively. This work will require us to think differently even about our own foundational principles, because we have ourselves made this knot tighter through the many mischances that my story told about, and many, many others. We might start by articulating our reasons for students' right to their own language, not as an act of graciousness, but largely for the benefit of the monolingual students who lack experience with larger cultural competencies and communication methods that are embedded in our communities. Those are the students who would benefit by learning about the very effective dialects and language styles used in various communities as part of what higher ed is fond of calling preparation for the real world. The real world is diverse. It speaks many languages and dialects, and it requires multiple language competencies. We can prepare students for it by being less prescriptive, and by valuing our students' experiences with varied language styles beyond our classrooms. Engagement with our communities, and I mean our own engagement, not just students, can help us to build a less constricted real world if we take with us what Zen philosophy would call a beginner's mind. And if we add the tools of reflection, respect, and rhetoric, a new 3 R's, as we do so, we might create outcomes that draw upon the things that I should have learned from our frequent retreats from the fight. What I've been wondering, and what I invite you to wonder with me, is this: what would happen if we ignored those who control access to and forms of literacy education in our classrooms, asserted what power we do have, and slipped out the back door of the classroom with our students into our communities? That is where people already know their rights and already exercise their own languages, and where people don't tie themselves up in knots. I welcome your thoughts and reactions throughout the rest of this conference. Thank you.
Okay. So, questions before we give this gentleman proper thank you again. Questions? We have moving mic here, I guess.
Thanks, Dominic, for an amazing keynote address. Last year, I had the fortune of speaking with Father John O'Malley, who was one of the leading Jesuit historians before he passed away. And my question for him was, why at even socially justice-oriented universities like Jesuit universities, do more faculty members not do what you just encouraged us to do? And his answer was, because they're not trained to do so in graduate school. Not so much a lack of service learning and community engagement, community-based research at the undergraduate level, but it's the lack of training in how to do that in graduate school. So in order for more of us to be able to do this, what are some thoughts that you have and some suggestions that you have to integrate this kind of work more into the graduate training that we get?
Thank you for that question. I would welcome other people's thoughts on that as well, but I would say from my standpoint, I've never worked with graduate students, so I can't speak authoritatively about that. But I can say that I do think the work we do on our project-based learning courses at your college, those kind of things could easily translate to certain graduate seminars. So for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. We work with our local African-American cemetery, Lebanon Cemetery in New York, where the gravestones are actually literally sticking into the earth, but with them were the identities of those folks. There's a group working on that physically, but we had our students go out and actually research through newspapers.com and other sources some of the really impressive people that were buried in this place and to try to write their life stories. Something like that, I think, has lent itself to certain graduate seminars. We've also worked with several other community organizations. We worked with one of the Underground Railroad houses in New York. We've worked with several other historical locations to try and get our students thinking about this. But as they do, and this is sort of the part that is not curricular, but just experiential, as they do, they are working with people different than themselves. Your college, despite the fact that York itself is about 70% people of color, your college is about maybe 20% people of color. As they work with people different than themselves, they learn to communicate differently, and they learn to value the communication styles of others. And so I think, as I said at the end of this talk, getting out in the community and graduate seminars is still possible. And I think that work we prepare folks for it. That's one idea, but if others have thoughts on that, I think it's a really important question. Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, for the great talk today. I also just wanted to thank our sponsors again and remind people to check out the exhibition hall. We have some community mentors over there as well. Thank you for being here today. And I just wanted to take a moment to invite Peter from Incredible Books up. As I mentioned yesterday, the other day, they're our lead sponsor for the conference, so we're really appreciative of their work. And so he's just going to take a couple minutes to talk about that.
Hi everyone, thank you. My name is Pete. I'm here with my colleague Stefan. I just wanted to give a brief overview of who we are, what we're up to, and invite you all to come back and say hi to us at our table back there. So Threadable is a social reading and annotation platform that allows teachers and students to come together within books and have threaded conversations in the margins while you read. Our company was founded by former academics and teachers who have a number of years in higher education. So a lot of the challenges that have been brought up so far today throughout this conference and yesterday, especially regarding students, are very familiar to us. So reading and writing skills, student engagement, collaboration, especially given COVID and obviously with the rise of new AI tools. These are all things that we've looked at from an educator's perspective and has really informed the way in which we've tried to build this product. I think what makes us a little bit different from some of the other social annotation tools that you've used or heard of is that we're really focused on the sort of student-centered design. We're really trying to build a product that we think students and you all will enjoy. And it looks and feels like collaboration tools and social media, things that your students are using already all the time. So really trying to meet them where they are. Yeah, so that's us. Stop by our table, come say hi. Our product is free. We're not trying to sell anything. We're just looking for people who might be interested in piloting it in their classrooms, either this fall or in the spring. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. About to turn it over to Katie, who's going to talk about tonight's social event. But you have a little bit of time before that, after the session ends. If you want to get out, outside the casino, I recommend walking down to the river. We have a great path along there. It's warm, but you can also dip your feet in the river too. It's a cool, 65 degrees or something in there. So very clean. I kayak in there a lot. And if you want any local tips that you're staying on after, feel free to ask any of us that as well. So.
I hope you all enjoyed Taco Tuesday, right? It was an excellent lunch. Thank you to the catering crew. Tonight's dinner is a taste of the South. So just to get your bellies ready for some yummy fried chicken. That's what we'll be having at the planetarium. There will be a shuttle starting at 5:45. It's going to be directly outside the bell desk. So if you go up the escalators, down to the other side of the building, go out the doors on the left. You'll see some shuttles beginning at 5:45, running continuously. So you can hop on one to get up to the planetarium. Parking information is added to the app. If you're driving yourself, I suggest you park in the West Stadium parking structure, and you can find directions on the Guidebook app. I think those were all of my announcements. Jim, Todd, and I just wanted to take a minute before we excuse you to thank and acknowledge Lillian and all the work that's gone into this conference and to step in. Lillian, there you are. Yes. I don't know if you all know exactly how much this amazing woman has taken on, but she really stepped up to the task of planning a conference, which is daunting in good times, in the best times. We're kind of coming out of bad times. And Lillian has really stepped up as she held us all accountable and helped keep us all organized for the last 10 months as we planned this conference. She stepped into a leadership role during a very tumultuous time in our organization and has provided leadership with empathy and grace. And she's done a great job helping revive this conference as a way to reinvigorate our important organization. So she's been very generous with the praise for me and Jim and Todd and our local committees. But I want to make sure that we know that all of that logistical work would not have been possible without the vision that Lillian brought to the table. And brought to the Zooms, many Zoom meetings we've held. So we just want to thank you for making this all possible, and we have a small gift for you that I'll give you tomorrow after the Institute. So thank you, Lillian. All right, folks, thank you, and have a great afternoon of sessions. I hope to see you at the planetarium tonight.
Oh, we got my daughter watching the live stream.